Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this important Washoe County talk on racism in America. We thank you so much for taking the time out this evening to join us. I want to give a little bit of background about how Washoe Talks came to be. First of all, my name is Amanda Mongolo. I am a program and outreach librarian at the Incline Village Library. About 3 years ago, our branch manager up there decided to start what we call a Tahoe Talks. And it was an opportunity for our community to come together in a safe place and talk about important topics and really hot button kind of politically charged topics. So up in Incline Village, we've talked about everything from gun control, medical marijuana, recreational marijuana. We also had a talk on racism in America. So what we do in Tahoe is we sit in a circle, our neighbors sit next to us, and we talk. We learn about each other, other people's opinions and views. And so we wanted to take that to the entire library system with this talk. And we thought this would be a great time to do that with the current events being like they are and this hot topic really sitting in our laps. So unfortunately, because of COVID, we can't sit next to each other, but maybe through this talk, we can sit as a community virtually and really get to know one another and see how we can stop this racism in America. So I will go ahead and introduce our 5 panelists. We will give our panelists about 3 to 5 minutes to talk about the topic, and then we will open up to questions that you guys put in the chat room. Right, so without further ado, our first panelist is Monique Normand. She's a local activist with the Black Lives Matter movement and a licensed social worker in Reno, Nevada. Don Dike-Anukam is a student political writer for This Is Reno. Dr. Precious Hall is a professor of political science at Truckee Meadows Community College. Dr. Greta de Jong is a professor of African American history at the University of Nevada at Reno. And Dr. Callum Ingram is a professor of political science also at the University of Nevada at Reno. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Monique. She'll introduce herself and then we'll move right along to the other panelists. So go ahead, Monique. Oh. Monique, can you unmute yourself?
Sorry.
That's okay, all good.
Of course. Sorry about that. So yeah, as I was saying, my name is Monique, and I am originally from Las Vegas, Nevada, but I've been in Reno for a while now. And kind of how I got started in kind of what I'm involved in now is I was a community organizer with the organization Progressive Leadership Alliance in Nevada. I helped to organize the Black Lives Matters marches that happened a few years back. And then I kind of jumped in and just kind of been helping with some of the things that have been going on here in Reno now. I am a social worker, and overall, you know, even though, you know, I'm no longer a paid organizer, right, anymore. These are all issues that are important to me, and so you know, I just feel it's important to help where I can and stay involved. And the other thing I want to say is Reno does not have an official chapter of Black Lives Matters chapter. It's kind of just, you know, a movement, and that's the same for a lot of other states out there that don't have an official chapter at this point. It's just regular people, right? Just kind of coming to the forefront and then deciding, you know, that they want to be involved. And the whole purpose of Black Lives Matters is basically, you know, to draw attention and to advocate for police violence in Black communities. So that's it.
Our next panelist is Don Dike-Anukam. And if we can have him begin to speak.
Hi, thank you for speaking, Monique, and thank you, Carla, for the introduction. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. I guess I'm going to apologize for having a mask on. I'm actually in a public space, so abiding by the governor's directive on wearing a mask in a public location or public space, I'm abiding by that policy. So good evening to all those watching tonight in Washoe County, Northern Nevada, wherever else you may be. My name is Don Dike-Anukam. I'm the student political writer at This Is Reno in Reno, Nevada. My job over at This Is Reno is basically covering political events, political issues, and events of that nature, from political rallies to dignitary visits to interactions between members of both Republican, Democratic, Libertarian, or whatever political actors in the community. And why this movement and this issue is of interest to me presently is naturally it's the issue of the day today. It's the issue that is naturally got our attention, stemming from the death, at least in this time around, in this iteration, and this time, and in this being an election year, the 2020 presidential election year, stemming from the death of Minneapolis resident George Floyd, who was killed due to having an officer standing on this officer Derek Chauvin, if I'm mispronouncing, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing his name, kneeling on his neck for about 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And from the eyewitness video of that death sparked national outrage, which has led to also, corresponding to the shooting death of Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky, during a no-knock raid by Louisville police, and then not really sure how to describe an event that occurred in Georgia, but I can't think of the young man's name, who's Mr. Arbery's death in Georgia, being kind of chased down by members of the community who thought he was doing something near a construction scene. I guess these numbers of deaths have led to a series of national outrage and demonstrations, which have ranged from peaceful to violent at times throughout the last several months during the coronavirus pandemic and national shutdown, so to speak. Which in itself, that issue has kind of also exacerbated current disparities in American society, seen by members of the African American community and other minority communities in healthcare, economics, and other systemic divides. And so essentially my goal in this moment is to observe and report what's happening, and naturally the fault line of racism runs through it to a degree, namely in whether or not systemic issues related to racism, bias, discrimination, and prejudice have played a factor in poor outcomes in healthcare regarding to the coronavirus outcome, to going right back to my starting point of Mr. George Floyd's death, why he was treated the way he was in that while he's under police custody. So I hope that tonight we, in our discussion, have a chance to talk about these things, these observations, these concerns, in a factual, objective, fair-minded manner.
Our next panelist is Dr. Precious Hall from Truckee Meadows College. Dr. Hall?
All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I'm very happy to be here. I've done a couple of Tahoe talks in times past, one on immigration, one on impeachment, and this is sort of a do-over for me on the talk of racism, as I was scheduled to do a Tahoe talk February of 2019. in Incline Village, but got snowed out and couldn't pass over into Mount Rose. So I'm very happy to be here this evening. I am a native of Baltimore, Maryland, but I've been living and working in Reno since 2012. After achieving my master's and PhD from Georgia State University, I came to TMCC because I'm very much aware of the fact that for me, I do like to engage in my research, but I also like to be in the classroom, and I like to have a bit of a focus on teaching students. And the community college has a very special mission, being that open access institution where we try to reach out to all, reach out to those who could be at Harvard or Yale if they wanted to, but life circumstances dictate that they're in Reno, and reach out to those who maybe didn't even pass high school, or maybe were unable to achieve even a high school diploma at the time, and they're trying to go back and do some things differently. So I like being able to teach classes that really reach that diversity of students. In addition to the classes that I teach in American politics, I am a race scholar, and a race scholar broadly defined. Right now, what I'm studying is a race scholar. I study the intersections of gender, race, and motherhood. And I also study parallels between the Black Panther Party and the Black Lives Matter movement. A lot of what we see today with how the Black Lives Matter movement is portrayed and characterized has some similarities with what happened with the Black Panther Party in the 1960s. So seeing how there were government operations to actually diminish the strength of these particular organizations. But more importantly, as someone who is a race scholar, what I study is race as a social construct. And every society has socially constructed the meaning behind race. And what that means to be Black or African American here in the United States is not what it means on a global or a universal scale. And how we have used historically the conceptions and the definitions of race and the meaning of race to assert power and privilege of different groups. So that's really what I like to study, what I try to teach my students, as far as there's nothing scientifically that differs from who we are, whether you are white, Black, Hispanic, Latino, Asian. We have assessed meaning to race in our country, and different races have different power and privilege in the United States. So that's just a little introduction about me. I definitely look forward to the questions this evening, and to really having a heartfelt community conversation about present day issues regarding race. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hall. Our next panelist is Dr. Greta de Jong. She's from the University of Nevada. Dr. de Jong?
Oh, okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Kyla, for the introduction. I'm a professor at UNR. I teach and do research on African American history, especially focusing on connections between race and class, and the ways that Black people have struggled for racial and economic justice through the 20th century. And looking at racism from a historical perspective, I found is really useful, and I hope it's useful to my students too. I think it helps us to see it as a system that was created by human actions, like human decision making, as opposed to something that just comes out of nowhere or is just an inherent part of human nature that you can't do anything about. If you look at it as a system that was created through things that were done in the past, you start to see how that system can be dismantled by things and choices that we make in the present. So I think it's really important to look at racism that way. It's not just a matter of individual beliefs or actions by people who are prejudiced or who hate Black people. A lot of people associate racism with things like the Ku Klux Klan and kind of blatantly racist acts, but that's only one form that racism takes. And those individual prejudices and beliefs don't just come out of nowhere. They're really shaped by the structure of the society that we live in. We can trace the origins of that back to slavery and the ways that plantation owners very deliberately set white and Black workers apart from each other in the colonial era and defined African Americans as slaves for life. And so this meaning became attached to skin color. As Dr. Hall said, race is a social construction, and this is the way it was constructed in the North American colonies and then in the United States through this racialized class structure where Black people were enslaved and white people were free. And this created an association in people's minds between Blackness and enslavement and Blackness and low status. So that's the origins of it. And then you can kind of trace how that system evolved through various forms. After slavery was abolished, it was replaced by the Jim Crow system and another system of oppression that set Black people apart and taught a new generation of Americans the meaning of race by denying rights to African Americans and subjecting them to all kinds of horrendous violence, like lynching, if they tried to protest that system. Lynching was often justified by white supremacists who argued that it was necessary because Black people were just inherently inclined to criminal activity. And so they tried to justify it that way. But studies of lynching have shown that actually African Americans could be lynched for any reason. Often as small as just insulting a white person. So it's really a system of terrorization, and a lot of the violence and brutality that we still see in our society today is kind of a carryover from that. The civil rights movement in the 1960s did succeed in overthrowing the Jim Crow system and getting some more rights for African Americans, and a lot of white Americans, I think, kind of look at that and think that racism is over, or at least in the 60s they thought, racism was over because of that. But of course it wasn't. A lot of the structural inequalities are still present and were not fully addressed by the civil rights legislation that was passed in the mid-1960s. And so we still have a lot of racial disparities, especially in the criminal justice system, which a lot of scholars today have labeled the new Jim Crow. It's a new system, again, that teaches people the meaning of race, and that it disproportionately imprisons, incarcerates African Americans, and makes them subject to really heavy policing in their communities and very violent policing. And that is, of course, what Black Lives Matter movement was just one of the things that movement is trying to address.
Thank you, Dr. De Jong. Our next panelist is Dr. Callum Ingram. He's also a professor at the University of Nevada, Reno. Dr. Ingram?
Hey all. So I'm an assistant professor in the political science department. I teach political philosophy, teach classes on identity politics, specifically focusing on identity politics in the United States. I think, like Precious said, like we always have to situate when we're talking about identity in the social background that it is. So, it's not like identity universally, identity in the United States, social movement organizations, political ethics, things like that. I guess I'm specifically probably on this panel because my research tends to focus both on structural oppression. So what does it mean to describe forms of oppression or forms of injustice as structural? And then I'll also, in my research, try to kind of unpack the implications of like, what does this structure talk mean for when we're thinking about like the forms of like organization, civil disobedience, protest, and dissent that might actually be adequate to transforming these structures. Like, we all agree that, oppression is bad. Okay, what do we got to do to get rid of it if a lot of the forms that it takes are structural? So yeah, like kind of, Greta was saying some of the similar points to this, but, and I'm sure we'll get more into this stuff later, but yeah, one of the kind of key ideas between like a structural understanding of racism is that racism isn't just something that is done like intentionally by individual racists. It's not just somebody who's wearing white robes or sitting in Congress or maybe doing both that's actually the kind of racist that we need to worry about. But the racism is also something that's built into our habits. It's built into our language. It's built into our institutions, our economies, the built environment, the way we organize architecture and the organized space. It's built into our media. Almost everything is kind of tied into these oppressive, these racist sort of social structures. So in some ways, like, it doesn't matter. You might be the most well-meaning person in the world. I'm right now going through the process of trying to find a house. I'm trying to do it in a way that, hopefully I'm, I don't want to participate in racist institutions by doing it, but there's almost no way to say go about purchasing a house in America without tying yourself into these vast networks that are shaped by racist histories and racist presence. That this is something that no matter how well-intentioned you are, structural racism is something, it kind of defines the world we live in. So my work focuses on that. And then kind of, I think the part of it that I'm more invested in, the more exciting kind of part of it is thinking about the kinds of like truly, I think, at least I make the argument, truly radical transformations that might actually be necessary if we were to combat structural oppression. If we actually wanted to fight racial and overcome racial disparities in wealth or in access to education or in healthcare or in policing or pretty much any other social phenomena, we would need to kind of think fairly radically about how we would need to transform society, what we need to change, how deep those changes need to go. These are truly radical changes, I say. I mean, I would actually make the argument that like, without being, there is no moderate approach to anti-racism. It's something that you have to be radical about. And so that's kind of part of it. And then also thinking a little bit in my research about the way that other coalitions and movements, how this could be a sort of intersectional anti-oppression politics. So how can anti-racists, anti-sexists, but people who are anti-homophobia, anti-capitalists work together in sort of building a kind of post-oppression society? So thinking about how we can actually unite a kind of movement of movements or a coalition, broader set of solidarities. Yeah, so I'll be super happy to talk about that stuff later on in the chat. I'm really excited to listen and to hear your questions. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. One thing I forgot to do is mention that I have a fellow moderator here across the room from me, and that's my colleague Carla, who kind of stepped in as we were having technical difficulties, or I was having technical difficulties. So thank you, Carla. One thing before we kind of open up the chat, I did want to go over the goals of this program and some of the ground rules. This is something that we usually put up on the board when we have our Tahoe Talks. So I think we're going to share the screen here. So some of the ground rules for this conversation is that it is a kitchen table conversation. We hope that everyone participates and that not one person dominates. And there are no right answers. Share your experiences, your views, and your beliefs. Please keep an open mind. Listen carefully. You know, we're all here. This is our community. These are our neighbors, our friends, our family, and try to understand each other's views. Help keep the conversation on track. Stick to the topic and try not to ramble. And it's okay to disagree, but let's not be disagreeable. And then some of our goals. Our goals are to build and maintain relationships during decisive political times, attract people who want to discuss issues instead of debating them, and we want to create a safe space, a safe public space for difficult conversations. So with that, we will open up the chat, and we hope that you guys have a whole bunch of questions for us, for our panelists to answer.
Yes, there is a question from the chat. It is, what is the most important next step to take in Reno to fight structural racism? And what are the strongest forces that stand in the way of our doing that here?
I would say one thing right now, you know, currently we are having, you know, a special session, and I know at the legislature, and I know that that session is focused around budget. But one of the things that, you know, could possibly come for that is a second session around police reform. And so I think that is one solid way, you know, of focusing, you know, our efforts on that and trying to push, you know, our governor and our legislature right now in having that second special session to address some of these issues around race and around police, right? I'm sure there's, oh, I know there's lots of other things, so that's just my one thing.
Okay, the next question is, how do you keep discussions of race from becoming discussions of politics, meaning one-on-one conversations or conversations on social media?
I think the key in having a dialogue that's ensuring there's equity, I think, is ensuring that the platform enables that. And so this is kind of my observation as a member of the Fourth Estate. All too often, I think people see on social media, you know, in terms of like chat rooms and, you know, threads gets taken as discourse, but in reality ends up kind of being a one-sided, either yelling match or kind of the worst of society and our worst tendencies coming out. And I think things like this, when members of the community engage in an open platform and kind of try to form some form of civil discourse, that enables and allows that discussion to occur, as well as I think allowing outlets to take in content from the public at large, like letters to the editor, columns and things of that nature online. That helps too to continue this discussion in a I'm not trying to phrase it as a progressive manner, but in some form of a continuing dialogue. That's just kind of my 2 cents on that, because my fear is that it's very easy for these debates, these discussions to become political discussions, as in, point scoring or trying to define one group versus another, as opposed to okay, let's try to talk about a solution and let's try to have an actual one-on-one or some form of exchange of ideas. And that's just kind of just my, couple 2 cents on that there.
Okay, we have another question. This question, what does equality look like in America? Does it mean white people get pulled down or Black people lifted up? How does it happen? How does that happen again and again, and what does it look like? So I guess, what does equality look like?
I guess I'll chime in on this particular question. I think one of the things that we have to consider is not a question of what does equality look like, but is equality what individuals are asking for, or is equity what individuals are asking for? Because equality and equity are not one and the same. So the definition of equality is everybody is being treated the same. But equity has a recognition that people need to be helped in different proportions. And one of the things that I would encourage people to think about, because oftentimes we think about, well, to make people of color equal or Black people equal, that's the question. Do we have to hold individuals who identify as white back? That's not necessarily what people are saying. What people are saying is there needs to be a recognition that Black people and people of color in our country have not been treated equitably throughout our history. So a lot of what we see today is a result of the equity or the equality that did not happen, which is why we need equity today. So the best way that I could explain that would be to give the definition of track and field. When people are running in track, because the track is curved, not everybody starts, particularly if was a whole circle 400 meters. I think obviously I'm not in track and field, but because the track is curved, everybody does not start at the same point, because there has to be a consideration that if you start ahead of the curve or if you start behind the curve, you will have an advantage or disadvantage in comparison to everyone in the race. What's being called for is equity. And a lot of this, I recently wrote a book chapter about this myth of the bootstrap mentality that we have here in the United States. And the myth says today in the 21st century, oh, as an African American or as a person of color, you have everything you need to be successful, to have wealth, etc. But that's not true when we look at not only the wealth gap that exists today, but we also look at the fact that particularly after the Civil War, there were deliberate laws, there were deliberate policies that were meant to hold people of color back. Those laws and those policies were in existence for decades upon decades. I'm talking about post-slavery. I'm not even talking about the institution of slavery. When slavery entered is a whole different conversation in and of itself. But post-slavery in the United States, there were deliberate laws and policies put in place to advance one group over another. So what we're asking for, and this goes back to the first question, what is it going to take? How do we sort of end these barriers? There has to be a recognition and a truth. There has to be a reckoning with the truth. Instead of sweeping facts under the rug, we have to recognize that really equality is not the call for today. Equity is the call for today, based historically on how people of color have been treated, the laws, the policies, and the systematic oppression that has continued to occur since the founding of this country. I know that was a mouthful, but.
Dr. Hall, that was beautifully said.
Thank you.
I mean, that brought light bulb went on in my head, so thank you. We do have another question in the chat. Carla, do you want to take that?
Yes. The next question is, what are the historical factors that have come into play today to cause the proliferation of anti-Black violence?
Try that one. So, you know, the violence is rooted in slavery, which was an extremely violent system, and then carried through the Jim Crow era. And I think, you know, for centuries, African American lives have just been devalued through these structural forms of racism. And I think another very important historical factor to recognize and to also see it being carried through in the present is that in the Jim Crow era, for example, white people could basically attack and beat up and kill African Americans without much fear of being punished. Because the legal system was all dominated by white supremacists. If people were, you know, arrested and put on trial, they were usually acquitted because the juries were all white, and people just did not see white people killing Black people as a problem. And there are still, you know, structural aspects today that have perpetuated that, in the way that police are given a lot of leeway and forgiveness by juries and by the legal system when they mess up, either deliberately or unintentionally, and make decisions that end up with people getting killed. It's very hard to call police to account for doing those things, and I think that's another reason why you know, there is still this problem of anti-Black violence.
Yeah, kind of jumping in on that too. Like there's a kind of strain of, so you could call it sort of theory, critical race theory, I guess, that goes under the table, like label of Afro-pessimism, broadly says that like any investment that we have in white identity, the historical construction of white identity, the, you know, what we think of as being white is rooted in a kind of history of anti-Black violence. Like that there is ultimately no way to identify. This is why somebody's like, why can't I say white lives matter? Well, one of the things that's sort of like the shadow other half of that is that there is a sort of racism that has been built into whiteness historically over time, that it's hard to have a kind of racial identity as white without being sort of invested in the kind of pride and the privilege and the sort of like resentment of folks challenging your privilege that you know, is kind of like that, you know, is just kind of inherently racist. And so there's this sort of way also that at least we get, you know, we might say that, like, you know, the history of just like being, to the historical development of what it means to be white is itself anti-Black. Any investment in whiteness now is kind of going to root you in and connect you to this sort of long history that Greta is kind of helpfully bringing up there.
Thank you, Dr. Ingram. The next question we have is, do you see an opportunity to build a movement that can enact the radical policies we need to make the systemic changes needed to create an equitable culture and end anti-Black violence in all its fluid forms? For instance, ensuring equal per pupil spending in education.
I want to say, I feel like kind of with the shift of what's happening right now in our culture, I think there's definitely room, you know, for that to happen. And I think, I mean, across the United States, you know, I think that is like, we're kind of seeing the beginning of a movement happen, right? I think, again, that's why it's important for You know, for us, obviously, you know, go protest, be in the street, but we also need to be focusing on our legislature, you know, pressuring our legislators and letting them know the kinds of policies we want to see, the kinds of changes we want to see. And that means, you know, emailing them, that means, you know, sending Twitter posts, that means calling them, you know, calling your representatives and letting them know, like, these are the changes I want to see. These are the things I want to see done in my community specifically, you know. Our legislature here only meets, you know, every other year. And so we're kind of unique in that way. And so that means that it takes time, you know, it takes a long time for things to happen. And so we kind of have this unique opportunity now. I mean, we're not gonna have just crazy giant change, but we have this opportunity right now to put a little pressure on them to get a second session started, you know, to voice the things we want to see. And that goes along with budget. They're looking at things around budget right now. You know, that goes along with education. I know, you know, right now we don't have a lot of money to spend because of COVID. But, you know, if there are specific things, you know, that you're thinking about right now that you want to see happen, I say, you know, contact your representative and let them know.
I'm going to add to that, if I may. And what I would like to add is just for people to think about really the words that we're using and what we're saying. We have to first question, are we really advocating and are we ready for systemic change? It is impossible to change one part of a system without the reverberation throughout the entire system. So in other words, what I am alluding to and what I am saying, and people, you know, point this into, you know, the communist aspect, that's not what I'm saying. Don't turn me in for being communist or anything like that. But what I am saying is, in order to dismantle the true systematic racism that has occurred and continues to occur in our country, that goes in tandem with the economic system. If we look at people like Martin Luther King towards the end of his life was becoming more and more communist in his leaning, more and more communist in his philosophical underpinnings. If you think about it, when Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968, he was not assassinated going to a march for people who are Black or people who are of color. He was assassinated marching for the equality in pay for white sanitation workers, because what he understood was that to dismantle this systemic racism is going to require a change in our financial and our economic system as well. And I think part of the problem of why we have continued to cycle with issues of race in our country is because we want to, particularly now, we want to fix something on the right side without understanding that it's going to affect what happens on the left side. This is going to be graphic, but if my right arm is injured and I could no longer use it, my system has to adjust in how to do things that I normally would. It infects the entire system. So are we asking for true systemic change? Are we ready? Are we prepared for what some of us may have to give up in order for the true change to occur? Or are we asking for, let's just change in this one area, but keep everything else about our society the same? And I would posit that it's impossible for us to do that. That's not how true systematic change works. Not to say that I have the answer, but I know that you can't change one part of a system without changing or reverberating those changes to the complete system itself.
I think actually for me, like that argument is so right. And it's one of the things that scares me the most about the book that's like jumped to the top of a lot of our like national bestseller lists right now, White Fragility, is I think ultimately, I mean, it's written by a white corporate consultant. So if you want to think about somebody who isn't necessarily be invested in systemic change, like that might be the sort of type, but like the kind of anti-racist practice that falls out of, I think, White Fragility and like a kind of a lot of the stuff that white folks embrace as anti-racism is this very sort of like, it's like self-work. Like you need to be really aware. You need to constantly be trying to be aware of your process. Being aware doesn't actually count as doing anything. Like, you actually need to advocate and go out and try to build something else. And I think a lot of things that folks mistake now for anti-racist action is actually this sort of like politics of like patting yourself on the back for feeling guilty rather than actually going out and trying to build power. And so, like, you know, read white fertility, that's totally fine. I don't mean to like trash on, Robin DiAngelo too much here. I kind of do, honestly. But like, you know, ultimately that, you know, it's not going to facilitate the sort of structurally transformative action, the sort of coalitions we need to build if you're just sort of constantly sitting and reading a book, then you're patting yourself on the back. Do you understand Pierre Bourdieu? Like, that's not a helpful thing. It's like actually thinking about, yeah, how can I work with folks to build something? Who am I building power with, rather than how am I making myself more aware alone in my living room, is I think kind of the important question here as well.
This next question is, it follows that train of thought. I find the progressive Marxist political ideology lens problematic in some ways. Can one do anti-racist work and not be progressive Marxist politically? In other words, in their moderate approach to anti-racism, I think I see it, but I see thinkers and advocates in this vein. So I think the question is, what you were talking about, can we dismantle structural racism just a little bit? Or does the whole house need to come down? Do we need to build up something else?
Can I take a little shot at this one a little bit here on the edges? So I was at CPAC this year in Washington, and I had a chance to speak to quite a few African-American political leaders and leaders on the right in regards to the state of the movement and the conservative movement and where they were at in that. And one of the things I gathered in that conversation, or those conversations I had with, you know, prominent Fox News personalities, I actually kind of had a quick chat with Candace Owens that didn't go very well, and other people in that neck of the woods. Was the conversation wasn't so much focused as a group attitude or a collective motion to try to solve the issue of racism, but individual actions to try to lift individuals out of their own personal circumstances. Because, you know, I think the perspective that I'm adopting and hearing from, you know, African-American political leaders from the right, in my experience, is that the talk of racism doesn't really come up so much as it is a function of, okay, you know, the problems are there, the challenges are there. What are you going to do about it on your own? What are you going to do about it, trying to build your own set of values and problems and personal wealth, et cetera, et cetera. Because I really don't think from the right there's a way you approach you know, taking on structural racism without actually challenging those who actually engage in it, or at least are actively operating in that universe. And that's just kind of my observation in the political realm from my experiences, because for lack of a better word, it requires actually calling people out. It requires actually saying, hey, you probably should stop doing the wink and a nod stuff to, you know, talk of, you know, Confederate, you know, statues and things of that nature. I mean, just kind of a thought here to a degree. And again, this is just my observations as an observer, not an actual personal opinion. But that's just kind of points I'm throwing out there. If anyone wants to join in on that, in regards to, you know, any other perspectives they've seen on the right, or at least a moderate approach on this, I'm extremely willing to listen to it, because I would like to hear what the folks who have got a lot more research on this than I have to say.
I would just maybe say do whatever you're comfortable with, and just do whatever you can in terms of you just, how you think and read and educate yourself and look at the issue from different perspectives. I tend to agree with what Dr. Ingram said, that this cannot be solved without some pretty radical change in the society, especially given the connections between race and class and the ways that racism it essentially has operated as a wealth distribution system, right? That has distributed wealth in very unequal ways. And there's no way to address that other than thinking about, well, how can we distribute wealth differently? And some of that might involve distributing wealth from white communities to Black communities, or distributing wealth from wealthy people to poor people. So I think that's an essential part of the solution. And just from my own work and research, I don't see, I'm not sure that moderate solutions are enough. I think they will be very helpful, and if people can get behind them, that's great. But at some point, white Americans need to realize that racial justice is expensive, right? Achieving that is expensive, and they need to step up and be willing to do what it takes to achieve that.
So reparations, would that be a part of that to achieve racial justice?
I got to speak on the panel at the library. I guess that was I think it was on election day, actually, in November, on the topic of reparations. It was a great panel you put together, Carla. And I think, yeah, there was consensus, at least on the panel and among much of the audience, that, yeah, some form of reparations, under acknowledging, the root of reparations is the word repair, like acknowledging that there is something that needs to be repaired and that this is not a self-repairing system that actually will take, we can't just sort of like wait for the forceless force of justice to kind of do the work in the universe. We actually do need to undertake this process of social repair, and also to acknowledge, like, it's not just, people, the question that gets, asked when you start talking about reparations is always, okay, like, how big of a check? Why am I going to have to pay for it? Because, I didn't own slaves or something like that. But to, like, understand the way that privilege has worked historically, the way that kind of wealth is accumulated in ways that we can kind of actually use and reappropriate for racial justice is good, but also acknowledging this is like repair is a cultural process. It's a symbolic process. It's not just something that you necessarily write a check. You don't put a dollar sign next to. You don't not do that, but it's a kind of a both and thing for sure.
So could you explain a little bit about white privilege and how that has worked?
Like just sort of the idea of like what white privilege sort of is. There's like, I've heard like a lot of kind of, it's one of those things that's like a lot of folks explain through like analogy. It's like you never realized, like, okay, I didn't realize I was playing this video game on easy mode the whole time. And like somebody else is out there having to play it on hard mode. And then all of a sudden when somebody's like, oh, maybe, you keep beating the game, maybe you should like move up and play like one level harder or something like that. And then you just like get super resentful that like, no, then I won't be able to easily dominate. I think that sort of sense of like entitlement to ease, I think is actually a kind of, video gaming analogies are terrible to use for this because this is actually something that matters and I'm kind of anti-gaming. But I do at least sort of think understanding like privilege as a sort of set of things that you're not even necessarily aware of. It's sort of a set of things that you kind of carry along with you, things you don't have to think about, things you don't have to be aware of, challenges that you don't have to face. That at least it's like, part of the tip of the iceberg of this, but, there's going to be, I think, probably a lot of folks on the panel have like a lot of kind of other explanations of that as well.
What privilege in general just discusses the fact that you have a special right or a special advantage by being a part of a particular group. So when we're talking about white privilege as it relates here in the United States, we're talking about the rights, the advantages, or the immunity that one receives as being part of a particular group. And white privilege is a bit tricky because it exists in both the conscious and unconscious ways. So even those who are white and say, oh, I've never been privileged in my life, don't even realize the inaccuracies of that statement. So you might say, okay, well, how could I have ever been privileged? Everything I had that I worked for. Well, everything that I had that I worked for, but when you and I went up for the same job and your name was John and my name was Jamal, you got the interview and I didn't, even though we had the same qualifications because of the systematic oppression that works. When your grandfather went to the bank in the 1950s and the 1960s to get a loan to buy your family house. My grandfather wasn't even allowed in the bank to even fill out an application to see if he could get a loan. That's privilege. And what we don't understand is the exponential effect that decades of privilege have had on contemporaries in society today. When we talk about things such as privilege, things such as when you go to work, your work didn't necessarily poison you like it did my grandfather, who worked in a factory full of other people of color and all of them died of bone cancer at an early age. That's the privilege that exists. You think privilege is an individual right. Oh, I individually have never received anything. It's talking about the privilege that you have as a group that exists. You have the privilege, even if you are someone who is poor and white. You can clean up yourself and put on a suit, and there will be positive assumptions made about you versus me based on the color of my skin. That's a privilege. I don't have the privilege to voice my dissatisfaction at my job in fear of losing my job, but you feel that you may have the confidence to do so. Those are privileges that exist that you might say, well, I didn't ask for that. Nobody's saying that you asked for the privilege. It's just recognizing that it is true and that it does exist.
And Precious, can I add to that a little bit, because those points that you acknowledge, at least put some factual basis on. I've noticed in the public square at the national level, that's actually is much at debate. I mean, in regards to national discourse, and the fact that we're even discussing this openly in the public square is, believe it or not, an advancement from maybe 10 years ago, where if I think I openly had my reservations about even talking about this 10 years ago for fear that even raising this could potentially isolate me, or worse, marginalize me for basically seeming radical. So it's actually a bit of a bit of progress in a way that you're even able to discuss this in an open manner, because it's an uncomfortable topic, very uncomfortable with people in a lot of political and social spectrums. So I just wanted to throw that into the fray there.
Thank you so much. We do have another question that kind of follows in the same vein. Why or how did white, and they use white in capitals, become viewed as superior? How did we get to this problem? And did the problem exist before America? So what is the root of this problem, I guess, is the question.
So in the North American context, you can really trace it back to slavery. And it's interesting, there's this really great book called, I think it's called The Invention of the White Race, that kind of looks at all the different laws that were passed and the ways that people talked about difference in the early colonial period. And Europeans and Africans, you know, they recognized that they were different culturally and things like that. But it was really when African Americans were enslaved and race became connected to having, to being enslaved, and black skin became connected to being enslaved, that this kind of white identity really began to emerge in the colonies. Before then, the most frequent or the most significant difference between people was, you know, Christians versus not. And before the system became solidified, it was possible for African Americans to convert to Christianity and not be slaves, because it was against, you know, Christian religion to enslave other Christians. And then gradually those options were cut off, and the key distinction between people became skin color instead of those other kind of cultural differences. And then it became even more solidified with the rise of scientific racism in the 19th century, where the argument then became there were these biological differences between people of European descent and people of African and other kinds of descent. So then that made it seem like, oh, it's just science, right? These differences are inherent They're biological, there's nothing you can do about them. And partly, scientific racism grew out of the necessity for the United States and its political leaders to justify slavery in the land of the free. Like if you could write this group out of the group of people who were entitled to rights like life, liberty, and equality, you solve a dilemma there. It was really that's like that whole field of race science in some ways emerged in response to the American Revolution and the need to justify slavery by creating, this race, this scientific race.
One thing I just wanted to add, because a lot of people, even in the 21st century, still don't realize and don't know that when we talk about the institution of slavery, one of the things that I think is important to note is that slavery did exist before the European institution of slavery of the African slave. For example, slavery did exist in Africa prior to white Europeans coming. But the difference between the enslavement of Africans by white Europeans and the enslavement of Africans amongst each other is that the African system of slavery was one in which you could work yourself out of. It was not a perpetual institution that was created to create an inferior or a superior class. It was used as a means of either punishment or as a means to work off a debt that you had incurred, but it was not an institution that was meant to last forever. So the concept of slavery was not new when white Europeans came to Africa and saw that it was happening, but what the white Europeans did was they transformed the institution of slavery for something that lasted, and in their idea, an indefinite period of time that you could not work yourself out of, and that you ultimately became and transformed into the definition of property outside of personhood. And anytime we remove somebody's personhood, it's easy to do whatever we want to them when they're not a person.
Thank you, Dr. Hall. The next question is, what are the techniques you would suggest a white person should use when confronted with racism among white peers? And I thought with this question, you could also explain white nationalism, white denial, some of the things that you might find when you're talking to someone who is of that mindset.
I can hop in for just a hot second, just say, at least for confronting, if you have, I don't know, you're sitting around and a friend of yours, if you're, speaking as a white person, if I have, I have a friend of mine who has recently actually voiced some problematic opinions to me. And I don't know, I think there's a lot of different ways to approach it fairly reasonably, but I think sometimes it's okay to also just like tell somebody like that's screwed up. Like you don't owe them necessarily a whole lot of time and explanation to spend a lot of your energy necessarily trying to bring them along. It's sometimes okay to just say like, that's screwed up. Like, what the hell? Like, and maybe even write, if somebody can't come to acknowledge that, if somebody is, in this case with my peer, like in their 30s and is just kind of like has these sort of racist opinions that they've been called out on but haven't done any work on, at some point it's just okay to just sort of like write somebody out of your life. But that said, there's also, you can very often do productive work with people to like just sort of like explain like, hey, you didn't, you might not realize that the vocabulary you're using, the assumptions you're making, that sort of a thing are problematic. And you can use that as a good opportunity to like kind of build a productive conversation. I saw one of the questions was on like cancel culture and sort of the prevalence of cancel culture now in the chat. And I think that like one of the worst things that does kind of come out of this kind of cancel culture is this sort of knee-jerk rejection that there is a possibility that somebody can learn. There are people that are sometimes, they can't learn, or they have too much of a sort of a pattern that they are kind of a person to give up on. But, I think cancel culture can be this sort of like counterproductive, more like it turns into this sort of like woker than thou competition that alienates folks rather than actually approaches people as, somebody who might be good natured but needs to learn, that sort of a thing. So, there's a lot of different techniques. It's totally okay for you to just say like, now the hell with you, I don't want you in my life anymore. but it's also okay and really laudable if you do want to put in that sort of a work and to try to figure out how you can do that work in a way that's productive, that won't generate resentment, that won't kind of generate sort of alienation, that won't sort of feed into like the sort of like white nationalist pipeline that kind of grows out of white resentment for being called out as a racist. That's a very complex process, and you kind of need to figure that, you know, it's okay if you don't want to go through it. That's, I guess, my.
Forgive me, I have to apologize. I stepped away for a sec. What was the question again?
The question was, what techniques would you suggest a white person use when confronted with racism among white peers?
Oh,
And
got
I suppose you're talking about maybe someone who might be a white nationalist, or how would you handle that?
Oh, gotcha. Gotcha. That would definitely, I think Callum's, I mean, I'm going to kind of exclude myself as my role here, but from what I heard from Callum's response, it sounds like he attempted to try to approach that from at least a balanced perspective. So I guess that's my input on that. Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. The next question.
If I could add to that, I would say that I do agree with what Callum said. And I think part of it too is not being afraid to call people to the carpet when they say and do things that are unacceptable. One of the things that we have to realize, and this is oftentimes when people, you know, I kind of hear the argument where people will say, well, if you don't like America so much, you know, you should go someplace else. You should be grateful for what you have. But even if you are a religious or a biblical person, it does say in the Bible, whom the Lord loveth, he chastiseth, which means that if you are my friend, if you are my family, and I love you as I ought to, as my friend, as my family member, I can't have you out here doing wrong. I can't have you out here being wrong without at least letting you know. Now, once you know, you become responsible for what you choose to do after that. But as far as being part of humanity together, if you roll with me and we are in the same circle, I cannot continue to let you go in your wrongness. It doesn't mean that I have to be obstinate. It doesn't mean that I have to be disrespectful, but it does mean that I have to find the courage. And it does take courage this day and time to let you know when you say and do things that are wrong, or when you say and do things that are inappropriate. And in today's culture, I may not be able to say something to your face, but maybe once I go home and I digest it, I can send you an email, or I can send you a text letting you know, hey, you said this, and do you really know, or are you really clear about what you said and what this really means? Because sometimes, particularly when we talk about cancel culture, people are not truly aware of what they're saying and the implications of what they're saying. Now, I will say there are some people who do deserve to be canceled, but that's certainly not true carte blanche of everyone who says and does these things.
Dr. Hall, there's also a question here. It says, Dr. Hall spoke on government operations to diminish Black Panther Party, similarly to the Black Lives Matter movement. Can she or any other panelists speak on any specific tactics being used in today's time, how to recognize it and combat it?
I guess I'll start since I was the one who brought that up. So just to be clear, first and foremost, when I was talking about government tactics of against the Black Panther Party, I was talking specifically about the FBI operation known as COINTELPRO. COINTELPRO was a multi-pronged energy of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, specifically to, one, classify the Black Panther Party as the #1 terrorist organization in the United States, and two, to diminish and demean the Black Panther Party in different ways, whether that was blocking funds for churches or other buildings that allowed them to feed children through their hunger program that was happening in Oakland, whether that was deliberately planning false stories in newspapers across the country. There was a multi-pronged operation that was happening through the FBI called COINTELPRO for the Black Panther Party. When we talk about the Black Lives Matter movement, I won't go too deeply into it because it's not to say that I'm saying there is an FBI operation that's happening. But what I am saying is that if we pay attention to how the Black Lives Matter movement is covered, what is said about the Black Lives Matter movement, particularly by the chief executive, the president of the United States, listen to the words and the characterization of the group, and you will see similar parallels in how they are painted as a group that's meant to terrorize. They are painted as a group that has evil proclivities. So it's not to say that there's a full-on FBI operation that's happening today against the Black Lives Matter movement, but it is to say that leaders in the government are characterizing these groups in similar fashions to tarnish the reputation and to diminish the purpose of these organizations and the good that these organizations have actually done.
So in other words, they're trying to stop the structural change to the systemic racism that we see.
Which usually happens for people at the top. People at the top and who benefit from the system don't want the system to change. Even if they know the system is wrong, it requires them to give up something, whether that's their superiority at the top, whether that's their top finances, whether that is tax incentives, whatever it is, it requires them to give up something. And rarely do people at the top want to give up what they have, even if they know that the system is wrong.
And is that also people who profess to be liberals, people who want to see change? Does that include?
Absolutely. This is not a Republican or a Democrat thing at all. This is a function of once you have power, once you have wealth, you are not one that wants to take yourself down from that. You're not one that wants to willingly give that up. And don't get me wrong, to an extent, that's human nature. People want to remain at the top. It's no fun being at the bottom. People want to remain at the top, but the reality is it's irrespective of your political ideology. What we see is that people give a lot of lip service to the change without actually doing an internal evaluation of what might it require me to give up in order for that change to occur.
I did see a question come in regarding defunding the police. Does anyone have any thoughts or opinions on that?
I can kind of add a little bit of context to what I have encountered with that so far. So from my observation, at least in the Northern Nevada area, forgive me if you can, I apologize if seniors changed a bit. I've actually gone outside from where I was at. So I'm actually standing outside in the Pennington building at UNR. So what I've kind of come to understand what the defund police movement is about, it has a bit of a three-pronged process, or three prongs I can observe. And if anyone has any points of information that I may be off on, please feel free to interject. So the movement kind of is stemming from redirecting funding that goes to police departments in terms of equipment, personnel, and resources to other social resources and other social community aspects. And that has occurred in such law enforcement agencies and such localities like New York City. The New York City City Council just did that not too long ago, where they cut their budget by, I don't have a precise amount at this time, but by a sizable portion in the upcoming fiscal year, and reallocate those resources towards community efforts, much to the chagrin to the police union, and creating more tension between the city council and between city council, Mayor de Blasio, and the police union. And also in Los Angeles, with the mayor in Los Angeles, I think cutting nearly $100 million out of the next year's budget toward from the police force towards other community efforts and other sort of like housing, healthcare, and other issues of that nature. And that's one prong of that. Another prong is kind of the extreme. It's a kind of extreme prong, so to speak, and that's a completely taking out or not even funding the police departments and restarting the whole concept of policing as we know it, which is the approach that the folks in Minneapolis are taking at this time. They basically are taking steps to disband that police force and reconfigure it and rebuild it from the start, with the hopes that by a newly constituted force, they can reestablish relationships with the community and members of communities of color in that area to rebuild broken trust, namely because of what's happened. And naturally, that's also the epicenter where the Floyd protests are. I think that's kind of one end, the extreme end of it. The next end of it, obviously, is to just kind of a combination of A and B, where you basically rechange the mission of what law enforcement agencies are doing in terms of, okay, instead of taking an enforcement focus on certain aspects like mental health and social policy, you now cooperate social workers and police officers on operations, which is something we've already been doing here in Northern Nevada for a while now. With the team's called the MOST team, where you have social workers and other social workers kind of working with law enforcement to try to find needs for these members. At the same time, trying to curtail and cut funding and resources to these agencies. So that's just kind of my observation of what that movement has taken as of late. And again, the spurring point of it, again, as of late, has been the Floyd protests as of late. So if anyone else has anything else to offer, please feel free to jump in.
I wanted to kind of change the conversation just a little bit and ask Monique. There's the slogan, all lives matter and Black lives matter. Why does Black lives matter? Can you explain?
Well, Black Lives Matter is because they haven't been mattering, like throughout history, right? Like in this country specifically. And so when we say Black Lives Matter, we're not saying all lives don't matter. I think this has been explained a lot, but the whole analogy with the burning house, right? So, the house is burning. It doesn't mean we go water other houses that aren't burning. It doesn't mean those houses don't matter. We put out the fire where it is. And so, I don't feel like I'm explaining that as much in today right now, but I know like when, the movement of Black Lives Matters first started, that was something specifically, that I was kind of like, what? Like a little thrown that people weren't kind of getting that. But that's the focus. It has nothing to do with other people not mattering. Obviously everyone's life matters. But right now we're talking about Black lives because that is the issue. Those are the people that are being basically, being harassed by the police, being stopped, being shot, so that's why it matters. Yeah. And other folks can jump in as well, but.
I actually do want to add into this a little bit because Monique, you kind of hit on this vein of this, which I've seen been the contrast point for protests all throughout Northern Nevada that I've been to, where you've got Black Lives Matter protesters speaking, and then you may have somebody on the opposite end just in absolute response, just have a visceral reaction to that, going, what do you mean that Black Lives Matter? And I feel like you've answered that question for those who may not understand, because I think that's kind of the point of your movement in my interactions, I think. Is that correct? Because it's unfortunately, I think on the opposite end, for those who hear the narrative of Black Lives Matter, feeling like, whoa, what about, like you said, yeah, lives do matter, but why is your life? Why are we focusing on your life more than other lives? Or in contrast, Blue Lives Matter or other movements of that nature, which I feel that's how I feel. In my observation, it's coming to. It seems to be more reactionary than it is actually based in actually listening to your message, I think. Would that be a close response to that?
Yeah, I also want to say you mentioned like the Blue Lives Matters, completely different. People are
Yes.
talking like you're just born with the blue life. Like that's not how that's not how it works, right? Like you were born Black, you are not born a police officer. And so that is a job you've decided to do. That's a role you've decided to take on. So yes, it is different. And I'm not saying, that their lives don't matter again, but I'm saying that's a very different the two things are not the same.
And I just want to clarify, just for the record, the Blue Lives Matter is reference to those who support or are in support of, police officers who are actively serving or who have served. And I'm trying to figure out how to nail that one down, because I'm not really sure the origin points of that movement in relation to your movement, or at least the movements that you're involved in, because it just seems to get brought up in the course of these debates and protests, and it doesn't seem to really have a point. Not that I disrespect police officers or officers or those who serve our communities, but in the relation to the social movement, its placing in this seems rather off-putting. If anything, more of a wedge, more of a wedge to help divide those who are observing the manners.
Would another question that I have, when we're talking about the Confederate monuments, renaming monuments, renaming buildings, renaming schools, do you have thoughts on that? Why there is a pushback and why both sides can't see the other
Hell of a
side?
campaign issue. I think adding why the Confederate monuments are coming back in vogue is, as of late. I mean just point blank, the current incumbent in Washington, who right now is not exactly polling very well. When he introduced this into the national fray several weeks ago, he thought it was something that would help him with his base. It was a political tool. And it's now only further inflamed public attentions on both sides, because it's been a source of debate and contention for a long time in regards to the removal, displacement, and kind of trying to sort that out. But
I was going to ask Dr. De Jong, could you explain a little bit about the history of how those monuments came about?
Yeah, so it's part of the way that white Southerners chose to remember the Civil War, which is as this kind of honorable fight, and people were fighting, for their land and families and for states' rights and against federal tyranny. That's how some Southerners wanted the war to be remembered, and there was an organized movement to present that through textbooks in the late 19th century and by building these monuments. And it's important to know that most of those monuments weren't built right after the Civil War, and they weren't really built to memorialize soldiers who died or any of that. They were built to uphold white supremacy and to remind African Americans of their place, because they came about at the same time that the Jim Crow system was being constructed, and they were a way to kind of venerate these white supremacists, these people. The Confederacy seceded from the United States in order to preserve slavery in the South. That's very clear from the historical documents, and the Lost Cause and the Confederate monuments were an attempt to rewrite that history. And that's why people see them as these racist structures and why they should be torn down.
I just like to chime in with that. One of the things you mentioned, Carla, was seeing both sides of the situation. And I'm just going to flat out say there are not two sides. Two sides do not exist to this situation. When you are talking about the Confederacy and the Civil War, the bottom line is that it was over the issue of slavery. the truth is that for some people, it was not an issue of slavery in terms of the racial domination of a particular group. It was an economic issue, but it was still over the issue of enslaving entire groups of people. So to want to memorialize that, what countries do you know memorialize wars that they lost? People don't do that. That's not normal for people to set up monuments for wars that they lost. That's the first thing. The second thing to consider as well is this corresponds a lot with the current president and his Make America Great Again slogan. Well, who are you talking to when you say to make America great again? Certainly you're not talking to Native Americans, because in order to make America great again for Native Americans, we have to go back to the founding of this country, when it was their country and they were able to freely roam the land and to live off the land before white Europeans came, killed, raped, stole their way of life, etc. Certainly you're not talking to African Americans, because even though there have been cases of what we call Black exceptionalism, which some people might consider, myself being a Black PhD as part of that, well, if you did it, anybody can do it. Nobody's looking at the systematic issues that prevent the parity in education levels, that prevent the parity in wealth levels. So who are you talking to when you say make America great again? Because there are many groups in this country where it was never great. People have managed to make great lives under horrendous circumstances, but that doesn't mean that America was ever great for them.
Thank you, Dr. Hall. I tend to agree with you about both sides, but I had to present both questions. So, but thank you. Do we have another one?
Real quick, I would just want to jump in. We're running short of time. I want to be respectful of our panelists' time and those who have joined us. Maybe we have room for one more question, two more questions, if anyone wants to put something in the chat real quick. There was one question that came in, I know that we addressed. How can white Americans help support Black businesses? I think that's kind of the gist of the question.
Buy from Black businesses. I mean, I mean, you know, I think, you know, I'm from Vegas, so in Vegas it's a little different. It's a little easier to seek those businesses out. And so here in Reno, you know, I think there has to be a little research done on our part, on our part, to kind of figure out where Black businesses are, who are the owners of those businesses, and then, you know, reach out to them or buy from them, you know, or go to their restaurants. It's a little, I would say it's a little more work here, but it can be done.
Thank you.
I would agree that it's a little more work as well. And a lot of research, I think, has to be done, because one of the ways that we can support Black-owned businesses and businesses in general that are owned by people of color, how about we stop banking with institutions that refuse to give small business loans to people of color? Why don't we ask these institutions, at what rates are you giving, are you approving these loans? And we stop putting our money with institutions that don't support businesses for all people. That requires a lot of research on our part, but there are things that we could do if we were really interested in addressing those issues.
All right, do we have any more questions there? How are you panelists doing? Do you want to continue?
Absolutely, yeah, yeah. I've got all night. Not actually all night, but you know, I can go as long as you want.
Don, you keep switching backgrounds on us.
I'm gonna keep it lively. Now.
All right, let me check the chat here, see if we missed anything. And for all the guests that are still with us, if we've missed a question, maybe you want to type it again so it's right at the top for us to see easily instead of us having to scroll. Or maybe our guest experts, were there any questions that Carla and I missed that you saw in the chat that you wanted to address?
I see a question from Ramona about Native Americans being able to open casinos and how it transformed their status in the US, and is there a similar way we can boost African Americans? I just want to talk about an organization that I studied as part of my research. And this actually relates to how to support Black-owned businesses as well. It's the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, which grew out of the Civil Rights Movement. It was kind of like the economic justice arm of the Civil Rights Movement in the South. What was happening was a lot of Black farmers were being displaced by mechanization and also politically motivated evictions because they were involved in the Civil Rights Movement. And the FSC just set about encouraging African Americans to form cooperative businesses, and they helped farmers stay on the land. They helped people create little manufacturing enterprises, and they still exist today. And so if you want an easy way to support Black businesses and to foster economic development in the South, which is where it's really needed because those rural Southern communities are some of the poorest places in the United States. But that would be one way to support it. And like their dream, their goal when they first began was to kind of create this broad scale economic development all across the South. And they got some federal funding for a while, but now they kind of struggle along, relying on foundation grants and things like that. So they're really underfunded in terms of what they would like to do with their mission. But it's an organization worth supporting. So I just wanted to let people know about that. And cooperatives, are a way, not just for African Americans, but I think a lot of different dispossessed and marginalized people could be an avenue for getting out of poverty. And it definitely was in the 1960s with the FSC. So.
One little kind of note also just on the question itself, the sort of idea that casinos transformed reservation life, I think also is maybe sort of a dangerous misconception as well. That, the sort of idea that the allowance to build casinos in some way has lifted America's indigenous population into some sort of position of social privilege or social equality or equity is, I think, kind of a misconception. Reservations continue to be, and indigenous populations continue to suffer huge impacts from, look at the sort of disparities in the COVID, both sort of mortality rates and access to healthcare, economic, educational inequalities, things like that. And so I think this idea both that the casinos kind of did that work is not quite right, but there's also the kind of, I don't know if something sort of so compartmentalized as, what business or what sort of single kind of transformative economic, institution or something could do all this work. I don't really know if that's how I don't know if there is a version of that. I don't know if shopping at Black-owned businesses is necessarily going to be that sort of holistic. It's definitely a best practice, but it's not going to sort of facilitate maybe the holistic reform that question maybe is kind of hoping for or something.
Another question is there such a thing as reverse racism?
I'm going to touch on this a little bit, and this is something I feel I have to be really careful about because this is more of an empirical experience statement that I'm going to indulge into. Sorry, Carol, I didn't know if you were going to assign that to somebody.
No, it was one of the questions that came through the chat.
Okay. So I've heard people talk to me about this in terms of at least in the political realm, that this event occurs in the sense that there's a perception that policies from affirmative action to point-based hiring acts as a discriminatory factor towards working class or like we call blue collar white constituents or voters. And it's more something I've heard on the right than I've heard more than anything else. It's more anecdotal than I've actually experienced. And I wish to speak that because that's kind of my level of interaction with that. I've actually attempted to try to find hard data on where that event occurs. And I wasn't really sure, and this is, I think when I tried to do this a couple of years ago, I I wasn't really sure where to start that research because I'm not sure what body of policy that encompasses or where I would start that search. And so that's just kind of my 2 cents on that. I'm kind of curious what the folks who have got a lot more, who've got some PhDs have to say about that concept, because there is a perception in the public sphere today, in the body politic and the social sphere, that people of color have a quote unquote privilege or have a quote unquote advantage that doesn't manifest itself, and in my own experience, in my own research, doesn't seem to demonstrate. So that's my 2 cents.
I just wanted to chime in. I don't believe that there is a such thing as reverse racism. Racism is all about a group that has power and privilege over another group. And so I think often what the word people are thinking of is prejudice and not necessarily racism. So you can be prejudiced against someone, against all kinds of things, but not racist, not reverse racist. So.
Thank you. We just got a message. Dr. Hall has to leave in a few minutes. Thank you so much, Dr. Hall, for being here. Incredible. Absolutely incredible.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I have a 13-month-old that I have to get to bed, so I wish I could stay a bit later, but thank you all for an incredible conversation. Have a great night.
And thank you for coming.
Yeah.
All right. I know there was a question regarding some books, what books are available, and Dr. Ingram put a huge list in the chat. So maybe you guys could take a look at that, and we can probably post that when we send this over to Facebook, this recording. But as a librarian, I guess we should point out that we do have several books here at the library. And on Overdrive or Libby, which is our ebooks and e-audiobook database, you can find a whole bunch of books on the topic. So do you have anything to add to that, Carla, my fellow librarian?
There's books on African American history. There's books on African American individuals, political that influence African American life. There's books on African American artists, for performers, intellectuals. So we have quite a large collection, and we have some of the newest books that have been published. So including Dr. De Jong's book is here. So if you would want to read that, please do. We have 2 of them.
I feel like maybe we should go ahead and end this conversation.
I did want to ask real quick, I think Dr. Achtenberg had a question. I don't know, did we get to that?
Absolutely.
Asked.
Do you have it up, Carla? Can you find that question? Let's see if I can find it.
I think she was asking about the sort of the different origins of like anti-indigenous forms of racism, anti-Black racism, and that's kind of maybe a sort of historical, a bit more of a historical question. Kind of what were their different origins, and maybe how they track differently over time.
I see a few comments here on some of the books that we have on Overdrive, like The New Jim Crow and Me and White Supremacy. And you can get those books on Overdrive now. They're available now. But I don't see the question, Dawn, that you were referring to.
I think we answered it. I think I remember saying something on that. I see a question from Corpse 1337. Will there be another Martin Luther King Jr.? Who will it be? And I say, nope, because it has to be all of us. we cannot rely on a single charismatic leader to lead us to freedom. It has to be all of us, and that's what the civil rights movement was behind Dr. King and behind his organizations. there were hundreds of thousands of just ordinary citizens getting involved in their local communities, engaging in grassroots activism, like Monique and Don and other people in our local community. And so that's what we all need to do. It's a collective effort, not a question of who's going to lead us.
I think one other thing, I love that sentiment. I think that's right. But also just, remembering, like, when King died, what was his, I think his disapproval rating in America? Like, do you approve of what Dr. King's doing? Was it over 70%? Like,
Yeah, I think it was 77%.
Yeah, and so I guess this is just to say, if there will never be another Dr. King, and there will not be a Dr. King that can solve the issues that we have. But if there was a Dr. King, he'd probably be hated by pretty much everybody in white America. And so doing all the work you possibly can, if you are if you're trying to be anti-racist, also be generous and thoughtful and recognize that, what makes you uncomfortable isn't necessarily something that's wrong.
You have a point there. It suddenly reminded me that our great, in terms of great political and public leaders, typically are in their contemporaries will always usually rate them as with low ratings or bad ratings. Like, I think Truman, we now look at Truman today with, rather high ratings today. And in his day, when he was getting booted out in 52, I believe, he was somewhere around the 30s. So you're right about social contemporarism.
Well, I think if we're, as Greta has said, we behave and we are infused with the spirit of Ella Baker and some of Tima Clark. If we join movements and are activists the way Monique is, then we'll make the change. But we can't depend on one person doing it. That's just not going to happen. Do you have any more thoughts? Does our panel have any more thoughts before we close out for the evening? Okay, I'd like to thank
Sorry, I was going to say thank you for this opportunity to engage in a frank and honest exchange of ideas and on a very difficult topic tonight. And thank you. I apologize for letting me interrupt a few times here and there.
No, you're fine. You're fine. I'm glad we got to have this wonderful conversation, and I hope everybody learned a little something from it. I'd like to thank all of you, Dr. De Jong, Dr. Callum Ingram, Monique Normand, Don, and Dr. Hall. If you could come to Washoe County Library when we reopen, we'd love to see you. In the meantime, we have online virtual programs that you can take part in, and we have online material and books that you can pick up in our grab and go. So thank you all for being here and coming.